In this episode of the Network State Podcast, we cover how history is a cryptic epic of twisting trajectories and microhistory. What the hell does that mean? Well, we get into that in the episode, but in short, the scale of history is huge, the time frame is long, and the measurements aren't just noisy, but intentionally corrupted. We then get into what microhistory is and how it's the history of reproducible systems. In other words, how it's a precise log of measurements we can use to increase the accuracy of how we predict the future. We explore how this applies to finance, spaceflight, and the scientific method, and how it's also a way we'll be able to hold network states accountable for their actions if their microhistory is transparent and publicly available. We're just starting out and could really use your support. So if you like this episode, please determinately push that like button off a cliff into a plush land of unicorn fairies. Share this episode, comment, let us know your thoughts on microhistory, and sign up for our newsletter. I promise we'll make it worth it for you. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Network State Podcast. How are we doing today, Raf?
So good. So happy to be back.
Awesome. So today we're going to be covering microhistory and macrohistory, and specifically history as a cryptic epic of twisting trajectories. Go ahead, share my screen here. You can all follow along. All right. Wow. So first point we have here is, what does this even mean, right? What is history as a cryptic epic of twisting trajectories?
It's the same question.
Yeah, it's very classic of Balaji to use this kind of very complicated language, but he does a good job of then explaining it all step by step, which is what we're going to try to do for you right here.
He is verbose.
He is very verbose. Okay, so he says that we can encode all of this into a phrase, which is history is a cryptic epic of twisting trajectories. Cryptic because the narrators are unreliable and often intentionally misleading. Epic because the timescales are so long that you have to consciously sample beyond your own experience and beyond any human lifetime to see patterns. Twisting because there are curves, cycles, collapses, and non-straightforward patterns. And trajectories because history is ultimately about the time evolution of human beings, weird way to say that, which maps the physical idea of a dynamical system of a set of particles progressing through time. So there's a lot that I could already, this is already so complicated.
Can we break down just those again?
Yeah.
What does epic mean?
Yes. We have to go through each one one at a time. All right. So, I mean, the cryptic piece, so because the narrators are unreliable and often intentionally misleading, we've talked about in previous episodes. And for those who haven't heard, right, the short note here is that history is either written by the winners or that history can be influenced by other actors. And so you don't really know whether or not the history that is being taught or told to you is actually reliable. It's often intentionally misleading. And so you kind of have to have a way of verifying that. That's the first point.
Just on that, because I know we hopefully we get to it, if not this episode, the next episode. Mm-hmm. The point about, like, I think what it highlights and what he introduces there is just understand that, you know, in a long form, like if you look at ancient history where the data is so scarce and so open to interpretation, and then also the data itself is like not super accurate, not well codified, or even almost impossible to contextualize. In that long form history, what we're left with is really, what is the purpose of that history? You know, why are we seeking out that? And I think that lesson applies today as well. It's as information becomes more and more, present, we just have more information. The way that history is framed today should also be like, well, what is the purpose for this interpretation of history? And we should be transparent about that. And if you're saying, well, I want the history to be portraying me in this light, that should be open, and it should be a real discussion of it. And I don't think that detracts from the value of history. It's just let's be honest about it, and understand that there probably isn't something such as an unbiased interpretation of history.
Exactly. Yeah. Like we need to understand that there are multiple actors influencing what is being taught, what is being said, as we've covered in previous episodes. And so you have to be skeptical here. Okay.
Yeah.
Moving to epic. He says, because the timescales are so long that you have to consciously sample beyond your own experience and beyond any human lifetime to see patterns. This one I completely agree with, and it makes a lot of sense. It's something that we've seen time and time again with traders. And someone who talks about this really well, I would say, is Ray Dalio, talking about creating principles instead of just looking at what has happened in recent past to determine your investment thesis. And those principles are based off these patterns that we can see in how an economy has performed when you zoom out hundreds and hundreds of years, right? And even further than that, right? Like, how has trade evolved internationally over hundreds and hundreds of years, so that if you were, and this is just a simple example, but if you were to look at the 1929 Great Depression crash and then compare that to the 2008 crash, you have what he calls another one of those, right? So an example that you can point to in the past to inform how you should act and react in the future when that thing happens again.
Yeah. I think epic is, I mean, these are
kind of
marketing
a weird
words for
yeah,
me. Yeah,
for sure.
like,
It's a weird way to describe that. I would have said like patterns or something like that, but epic is
experiential or something, or like beyond. Yeah, but like unbounded or something. But there, yeah, to that point, I think obviously we mentioned, even like once you start mentioning crashes, I think earlier on there's the idea of the Dutch, it's the famous Dutch implosion of the tulip trade or tulip exchange.
Yeah.
But
can you give like a quick masterclass for listeners on that, or is it too long?
I mean, it's just that, all those pretty pictures, you might have seen them on social media, of the pretty pictures of like when the Netherlands decides all the tulips are blooming, it's like an insane market, and it goes into all that used to be the primary like stock exchange value. It was basically what like Bitcoin was last year, I guess, where everybody was like, wow, tulips are the best, and then one person was like, well, they're just tulips. And everybody was like, wait, what do you mean? And then it imploded, and then people were like, okay, maybe we should regulate how houses are allowed to sell certain like what derivatives you're allowed to sell, and why, and what is it actually based on. And so I think it's because I think tulips themselves were a difficult commodity to work with, and there's a big point that also, interestingly enough, I don't know how much this is talked about, but the reason why tulips were chosen also because they portrayed a very interesting genetic, like biological evolution. So like mastering the color of what tulips you wanted to have was the trade, but that that was kind of like a secret process. And what you actually did with that probably shouldn't have been the foundation for an entire like stock exchange or thing like that, which I guess you could say with the same thing with blockchain if you don't understand it.
Yeah, like how do we denominate value, right? And it's funny that was flowers at a certain point. Well, there was seashells even before that, and bones and stuff before that.
Well, so that's the point I wanted to make, is that in each one of these, I think when we look at other experiential or like things beyond your own understanding, your own lifetime, I think good reference point are what's the infrastructure that was being used. If you want to go way back, clay tablets, literally receipts for exchange way back 5,000 years ago, 4,500 years ago. What's the infrastructure that's being used today, and how does that enable the fluidity of information or trade? And you can sort of see, okay, well, if it's this volume at this scale, then we should expect shocks like this, for example. And that's what I think people get really excited about when it comes to new technology. Maybe that's how I would understand epic, is like how epic is the infrastructure, basically.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then we've got twisting, which is because there are curves, cycles, collapses, and non-straightforward patterns, which to me like is kind of similar to why we look at the patterns in the first place, is to see these twists and curves and cycles and collapses. But it's just another way of saying it's not linear, right? So, and it's not straightforward. So you have to see like, what has the trajectory been in the past, in whatever shape it took, to then be able to see, oh, we have the same shape today, if we're plotting this on a graph.
Yeah, the way I understand this as well is if you can focus in on what are those moments and the factors that build up to those moments where you know it changes, it goes from a positive velocity to like a negative velocity, or acceleration, I guess. I do econ, not physics. If there are any physicians out there, physicians, that's not even the right word, is it? But any case, when that exact moment and what are those factors where it reverses the trend, I guess that's what you would mean by twisting, which is interesting to follow, I guess, if you can. Very difficult to do even in your own life, but worth the exercise. And I think journaling helps with that on a personal level. I know I've gotten into it. I tell other people to get into it probably more than I get into it. But I think that's what we're seeing with blockchain is here. We're journaling we have a historic case of what's happening. Let's see if we can, if that information is being cataloged, can we categorize those factors and learn from when the shift happens, basically.
Totally. All right, and then last we have trajectories, because history is ultimately about the time evolution of human beings. Again, I don't know why you say that, which maps to the physical idea of a dynamical system of a set of particles progressing through time. So we'll have to get to that point, because that part is actually a very interesting point. When you're thinking about, okay, and this is going to sound like way out there, but with space-time, we're essentially thinking that a particle doesn't have a past, present, and future. It just is, and you can see the trajectory of that particle throughout its past, present, and future. And therefore, it's just like, if we were to think about it in a 3D space, a squiggly line, right? And that's grossly oversimplifying, obviously. But if we can think of all of these different trajectories as a particle in space-time, and we can know exactly where it was at any point in time, and theoretically, predict where it will be in some point in the near future, that's really exciting, because then we can, one, have this objective form of truth, which is this blockchain verified history where we all agree on what happened in the past, or there is some unanimity there. And because of that, the kinds of predictions that we can make become more and more accurate for near future. And that could be very interesting for traders or any other kind of entrepreneurs, people that are looking for like the trends to take advantage of or to capitalize on.
Just to build off of that, I think we hopefully will get onto the point about finance and why that's important for why that could be significant for trade. But there is a real world example today of when a market was taken over by a platform. I forgot which form of I forgot which exact unit was being traded, if it was equity. I think it was equity. I don't know which market at which level, but there was this platform that came out which just handled all of the trades and then was able to sort of identify the moments where there would be like an action needed to be taken. So basically taking the role of the broker. And when that happened, suddenly the volume for that specific asset, in terms of the trading volume, just like went down. Like nobody was trading it anymore, because there was no like gray material where you're calling this price, I'm calling that price, and it's based off that gap that there's an actual market for it, right? Because it's in the gap that we can then charge a fee accordingly, because we've matched that mismatch of information. But when there's a platform that's taking the input and the output for you, the information is there's no asymmetry. It's all being plugged in with each other, and therefore there's no reason to trade, because there's no margin to make on that. That's something really interesting that's already happened in some, I'm going to say like equity markets, already here with some of the guys we talked to in London. But so this is a real world example of where actually too much information, too much data like analysis takes away the human element. And not to like justify that the human element actually should be so valuable that that is the basis for an entire industry, especially when it comes to brokering equity, where, you know, what's the added value there? But yeah, that could be catastrophic, you know, shifts in financial markets for that kind of, once you have that stuff in place. And maybe one of the reasons why there is not so much of an uptake, and also why this is perhaps a fringe conversation versus a mainstream conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be really interesting to see how this impacts our evolution and patterns and economics. So moving into now microhistory versus macrohistory. So this is like one of the topics that is going to be gargantuan to tackle, but we're going to give it our best shot here. So we're at microhistory is the history of reproducible systems. One which has few enough variables that it can be reset and replayed from the beginning in a series of controlled experiments. It is history as a quantitative trajectory, history as a precise log of measurements. So I don't know if that definition works. Raf, if we can, you know, how would we say this in layman's terms?
Yeah, for me, again, I'm going to bring in the individual personal example. It reminds me of Atomic Habits. I forgot his name, actually.
James Clear.
James Clear, right?
Yeah.
I love that name. I'm always like, it's a name that
He's
felt
pretty
like
clear.
it was made
Yeah.
to sell the book. Yeah.
Yeah.
But great book. Everybody should get it. But the way I see it, okay, look, this guy, James Clear, thought a lot about how to like improve individual action by understanding what are the processes for decision making and how to reduce that at an atomic level, so that you can then turn that into habits. So basically like make that the foundation or form for your life. Here I see the same model applied. This is the way that I would understand this is microhistory. Let's look at the things that we know we can keep happening, because we know those are the smallest actions that we can identify. And if you link them up together, then you're going to start seeing impact. So every day, you know, the UK stock exchange opens, and the prices are announced, and people can, and then that means, okay, people can review that information and people can start trading. So that for me is like a micro event of history which is happening, and yet like has all of these factors which are being measured and having a tremendous impact on what's going on in the world.
Yeah. It's really hard to put this in layman's terms, but I like my stab at it would be that it's like the scientific method on a micro scale. So what can we test in a small enough scale enough times that we get the same result, and therefore can predict with really good accuracy that if X happens, Y happens. And we're going to dive into biology stab at this, but to be honest, I think this actually makes it more complicated. But here we go. So he says that we can see this with technologies like the Kalman filter, which was used for steering the spaceship used in the moon landing. Roughly speaking, the Kalman filter uses past measurements. That was great. So yeah, like X open bracket T minus 1, X T minus 2, X T minus 3 to inform the estimate of a system's current state, X to T, the action that should be taken, U to T, and the corresponding prediction of the future state, X T plus 1, should that action be taken.
Can we just ask in the comments, has anybody actually read this and understood this? Please leave a comment if you have. We'd love to talk to you.
Actually, yeah, like any physics people, we would love for you to get involved in the conversation and like try to explain this in layman's terms. That would be awesome. But anyway, so to like why this is relevant to microhistory, he says, for example, it uses path velocity, direction headings, fuel levels, and the like to recommend how a space shuttle should be steered at the current time step. Crucially, if the microhistory is not accurate enough, if the confidence intervals around each measurement are too wide, or if say the velocity estimate is wrong altogether, then the Kalman filter does not work and Apollo doesn't happen. So to me, that part made a lot more sense. And it's essentially just saying, okay, if we have these metrics that tell us about the certain health or the certain performance of a specific thing, and we're using all these different metrics to then determine what should happen for this thing. So without getting too abstract, let's use the example of a startup, right? If we're looking at weekly growth rate and gross revenue and number of users, right? And the weekly growth rate is based off number of users, or revenue, doesn't really matter. And that is slowly declining. And we look at that, we can say, okay, well, if that's declining for revenue, but the number of users is increasing, then we're making less revenue per user. And therefore, we should look at how do we make more revenue per user, right? So it's just looking at like individual measurements that help you determine what actions you should take in the immediate future and to the extreme. And that's why it's micro history. So I don't know, how does that work?
I mean, it works for me. Like, I think the way that it breaks down, the way I see it, I guess you could compare this to, if you have the right information, a rational actor will do X, Y, and Z because the inputs are being analyzed under this system, and we trust the system and we trust the inputs. And therefore, this is the action being taken. I guess that would make this not microhistory, but microeconomics. Or if you go into financial economics, if like you just said, if the price of the stock goes up or down, and this happens every single day, well, we're saying, let's say if it goes up, up, up 3 days in a row, then we're going to say, okay, great, this thing is on the rise, therefore, buy or something else. And that makes sense if you believe that either the trend will keep continuing, therefore,
Right.
the inputs send the
That
same
the past
outputs.
can predict the future in some way.
Yeah, and you assume that, okay, well, people who are getting this information are also interpreting this information in the same way that I am. Of course, that is not always the case. There's other motivations, but I think for things around physics, it's a very good vacuum to put this into. I am not sure exactly where he's going with this. Like why do we want to apply this model here, apart from, okay, I guess this is the way you want to apply all of the information that that we would presumably be collecting via the blockchain
for a network state. Yeah, I think that's where he's going with it. And it's kind of okay. So first, let's dive into the next piece here, which is how it relates to finance, and then we can dive into some fun examples as well. So like he says, at a surface level, the Kalman filter resembles the kind of time series analysis that's common in finance. The key difference is that the Kalman filter is used on reproducible systems, while finance is typically a non-reproducible system. If you're using the Kalman filter to guide a drone from point A to point B, but you have a bug in your code and the drone crashes, you can simply pick up the drone, put it back on the launch pad at point A, and try again. Because you can repeat the experiment over and over, you can eventually get very precise measurements and a functioning guidance algorithm. That's a reproducible system. In finance, however, you usually can't keep rerunning a trading algorithm that makes money and gets the same result. Eventually, your counterparties will adapt and get wise. A key difference relative to our drone example is the presence of inanimate or animate objects or other humans who won't always do the same thing given the same input. In fact, they can often be adversarial, observing and reacting to your actions, intentionally confounding your predictions, especially if they can profit from doing so. Past performance is no guarantee of future results in finance, as opposed to physics. Unlike the situation with the drone, a market isn't a reproducible system. So he says microhistory thus has its limits, but it's an incredibly powerful concept. If we have good enough measurements on the past, then we have a better prediction of the future in an extremely literal sense. If we have tight confidence intervals on our measurements of the past, so I'm not even going to read this because I think that just complicates things. But conversely, the more uncertainty about your past, the more confused you are about where you're from and where you're going, the more likely your rocket will crash. It's Orwell more literally than he ever expected. He who controls the past controls the future in the direct sense that he has better control theory. Only a civilization with a strong capacity for accurate microhistory could ever make it to the moon. So just to quickly touch on this point, and then we'll finish this paragraph here, is he who controls the past controls the future, because he says, has better control theory. Without diving into that too much, it's just a better probability of success when it comes to predicting the near future because they have more accurate measurements of the past. And so he says, this is a powerful analogy for civilization. A group of people who doesn't know who they are or where they came from won't ever make it to the moon, let alone Mars. Can we make it more than an analogy? And then he jumps into microhistory. So before we go into that, comments on micro,
yeah. Well, the two things jump out at me at the end. Firstly, I think our unpacking at the beginning of his section actually really helped.
Yeah, for sure.
Like you get into it, you're like, okay, no, actually, I kind of see, I understand what he's trying to say. I believe at least the words make sense this time in sequence, as opposed to in the beginning where it's just like, oh, come on, give us.
He's giving you the bait at the beginning, right? Instead of like,
yeah.
We have our little realization moment once he clarifies everything later on. But yeah,
which I guess is why we're doing this, right? We're opening it up. Just two dudes chatting about something we're passionate about, which is what is all of this about. But I think the point that jumps out at me, again, analogous to this, is the rational actor aspect of it, because I think even for civilization, he's talking about the civilization being able to make it to the moon, but that's an action that's being done intrinsically, as once you're within that civilization. But there's going to be a competing civilization that's going to try to achieve something. It's not there's one civilization for all of society, all of the world, all people. There's going to be this other actor, and that you get into the same problem at that point, where it's like, well, again, there's another human element where you don't know how they're going to react, and probably they're just going to react to make it worse for you. So yeah, actually, for me, this is more just a better support of you see it in econ, you see it in IR, you see it, I guess, in philosophy or ethics, which is game theory, like where this
That's
really
what I was
actually
gonna go as well.
Where this actually makes sense is you could have the best information available. Again, is the opposite actor rational? What are their motivations? Let's say they have the same information, access to the same information, because okay, it seems like that's what this is going for. Doesn't mean anything, if they're going for a completely different goal. And so it's like, yay, great, but okay, game theory, we're back to the drawing board. Other states are going to act in a way to knock down other network state ideas, even before there's a majority of network state ideas, because it's in the interest of traditional nation states to maintain their hegemony, right? So even if you can say that the network state model for history is a better model, you're going to have, if it's really that much better, it's probably going to have a much stronger wall to push against, or like some obstacle that's going to try and stop it, possibly.
I think it just really increases competition and the stakes, right? It's not like these methods will completely change the game. They will, however, change the focus of the players, and they will change the sense of quote unquote objective truths. And that does make it like a more fair playing field it's not a fair playing field, but a more fair playing field than what we're currently playing on, I would say, where there's a lot more operating in the dark and a lot more manipulation that is easier to do. So
Super topical. Super topical, just as we're seeing in the US at this time, with all of the classified documentation being mishandled and realizing, okay, well, what is the volume of classified information and who actually has access to it? And that's just for the United States. Imagine that that's that scale for every single other country. I mean, the size, it's funny because I've only heard the side of like what's going on and what's the impact of US politics, but imagine what China does with its
yeah,
information.
it's
It's
mind-boggling.
at least times three, just on
At
sheer
least. Yeah.
population.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then probably it's like magnitudes of tens or hundreds maybe.
Yeah.
And that's just I mean we're talking maybe just in the last decade. So wait, at that point, what's their frequency and what's their model for information? Because that blows anybody out of the water by like just insane margins. I don't even know how if it's a war on information and who controls it. I mean, it's over.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I think so. I want to close out on microhistory because I know we got to wrap up. But what is microhistory, and more importantly, why is it important, right? So I think the distinction that he's making here is that microhistory, crucially, is for reproducible systems. What we're talking about with the non-reproducible systems, where there will be game theory involved, et cetera, I think is what he's going to dive into with macrohistory, which we'll cover on the next episode. But for microhistory, right, it's the idea that there are certain things that we can measure very accurately, and if we measure enough of those things, we have a better sense of what could happen in the future with a higher probability than without those measurements. And so it's basically just a way to think about history as a set of data points that, if measured very accurately in many different ways, can actually be a fairly reliable way to predict the near future. Is that fair?
I think it's a good premise. I see it as like here's the headline. That's the headline. That's the content that we're trying to understand. I'd love to hear more of like actual historical support for that. Because actually it's unfortunate that the example that he actually brings in is a like physics example
Right.
for a historical event, but it's a physics example. And the things that matter the most to how the well-being of a civilization are unlikely to be like breakthroughs in physics, my guess is, but on the day-to-day it's probably going to be market, commodity, I don't know, health, trade, whatever. Anything actually related to economics, which is a much more difficult system, and or even climate. Like climate, can you really predict that from past to future in a way that I don't know, that you can make better choices?
Yeah.
Hopefully, but how much is that represented across everything that you're doing? I don't know.
Right. And also, even if we nix the whole prediction part, which I think is an important piece of it, but it's not the most crucial. The more crucial piece is that we have this log of what happened, right? And it's
Yeah,
precise,
yeah,
and it's on multiple different variables that are
yeah,
now going to be indisputable or immutable for the future, right? And
yeah.
that
And
alone is powerful.
well, that alone, and I was gonna add, just beyond. I mean, like, great that it's indisputable and immutable, but really just that it's transparent and publicly
Right.
accessible. That
Right.
actually, that's the huge factor. That's if you're telling me this is all the information that we have, whatever metrics they are, and everybody can have access to them, that's a revolution. That's a revolution, and
Completely
so that's
agreed.
what I
And
want to see. But yeah.
same with, if this is presented at UN type conferences where everybody's on the same page, and like we talked about in previous episodes. So yeah, just having the measurements, and knowing that they're unchangeable, is a huge step forward in the right direction. Okay, anything to close out on this episode before wrapping up?
No, I'm excited for macro history.
Yeah, we
I'm
gotta.
personally, I did more macroeconomics, so that should be fun.
Yeah, I
If there's
think
any link.
yeah, I think that one will be also very relevant to some of the points that we just touched on here. So, guys, thank you so much for listening. Be sure to like, comment, share the episode if you
Subscribe.
enjoyed it. Yeah, gently caress that like button, show it who's boss at the same time. We'll see you in the next one.